define bias.
Bias is, we have to include unconscious bias on that, right? Because bias, by definition, is an automatic response. It is without judgment. You do it without thinking, right? Unconscious bias, we like to think of it as unconscious bias. Some people call it implicit bias, but ultimately it's something that happens without you thinking about it, right? And it happens without you thinking about it because you've had an entire lifetime of experiences that have informed your view of that thing.
Okay.
So it happens like this?
Yes.
Without thinking, but it is as a result of years and years and years of experience.
SpiceFM live streaming, standardmedia.co.ke. More hits on the way. Got some Beyonce, some Lady Gaga. Don't just listen, watch as I continue my conversation with a woman who is an expert in organizational health, 20 years experience in developmental finance, MBA in finance, master's in international economics, went to some Ivies. Yeah. Wharton, I heard, is the best business school in the U.S., #1 in business. Explains why she was working for the IFC for over 20 years, 6 years as country manager in Nigeria. And now you are helping leaders in organizations to be aware, to be better leaders, to be aware of the unconscious bias that they could have in the organization, or that is in the organization, so that more of their employees can succeed and the organization can succeed as a whole.
Absolutely.
That transformation, at what point did that happen, and what actually happened with regards to trainings, learnings for you to become an expert in organizational health?
Yeah, I mean, for me, as I recognize that there are so many businesses that are failing because of
poor leadership.
Yeah,
Let's be honest.
Poor leadership, essentially. And it's heartbreaking because, again, in the African context, we can't afford that. We need much more economic activity, not less. And so at the root of it for me was leadership. And so I started to just kind of pull the thread and kind of figure out what is this about. That's actually how I started training on facilitating conversations on unconscious bias, bringing it all together, doing a lot of reading on the topic. And I read a book that was, for me, is my go-to book. It's called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And it's written by my organizational health guru. His name is Patrick Lencioni. I think many consider him to be kind of one of the gurus on organizational health. And he approaches organizational health in a way that really resonates with me, because it is about leadership at the core and how teams work together and how you work on those dynamics. Because when you get all that right, then those smart people can do the things that they're supposed to do, right? It doesn't matter what the sector is, but you need to have those dynamics right. He's written a number of books. So his methodology is something that I follow. He has a new kind of methodology out there called the Working Genius, which basically is something that I also administer. And it really helps people think about how they show up on a team. Right. And so we've spent some time really trying to understand how to map people. So when people come and they want to do this, we map them, and then we figure out what is the role that they play on the team. Are they the innovator, or are they the executor, or are they the supporter? Right. Everybody plays a role on the team. So this approach to organizational health is what resonates most with me. Other people define it differently, but for me, it's really about how leadership organizes itself to make sure that you have a team that's effective, so that you have a very productive workplace, so that people can operate at their best. Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want their team to be at their absolute best? So for me, that's the core of it. So I've done quite a bit of trainings on all of this, working with companies, and unconscious bias has played a really important role in my approach to organizational health, because it is a way to help people think about how bias shows up in their decision making, how bias shows up in the workplace, right? And when bias shows up in decision making, and when bias shows up in the workplace, it can have, if it's not done well, it can have really detrimental impact on the company, right? If people are not working at their best, if people are suboptimal in what they're doing, the company suffers, right? So all of these things tie together for me. So bias, understanding unconscious bias for me is a way in which people can, leaders in particular, but like I said, everybody can help people understand why we make the decisions we make, how and why people are motivated to do the things that they do. I spent, while I was working at IFC, I was asked to do diversity and inclusion work. I didn't want to do it at first because I thought I have enough work to do, but when you're asked by your leadership to do something, you do it. And so I kind of fell into unconscious bias as a default. I didn't know anything about it when I was asked to learn about it and then help World Bank staff understand it. So I knew nothing, I'd never even heard the words before, to be honest. Yes. And so I got trained in it. And so for probably 4 years, I've facilitated conversations with scores of teams, hundreds of people within the World Bank Group and outside.
And this is not just in Nigeria. This was globally.
Globally, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. With teams all over the world, in place, in face-to-face and virtually. Once COVID happened, I did a lot of it virtually. Yeah. And now I do it when people ask me, I know them, I do it for small groups like church groups or social groups, just people who are very serious about wanting to be more effective as a team.
Yes.
And I just do it for them because ultimately I want to evangelize about unconscious bias because I think it explains a lot about what we see in the world. I think it explains a lot about what we see in the workplace. And if we have this context, we have this information, we have this knowledge, we can just build more empathy. And building more empathy, we just make better decisions. It just ultimately takes us all to a better place when we have this grounding. That's my belief about how powerful understanding unconscious bias is.
I love what you said about be more effective as a team. Be more effective as a team and as an organization, you can then thrive or at least grow. What are the fundamentals of unconscious bias? If anything, let's start with what we must know about this concept.
The first thing to know, and if you take nothing away from this conversation, the first thing, and maybe the last thing is, to be human is to be biased.
To be human is to be biased.
As a human being, we are by nature biased. It is what makes us human. Fundamentally core. And the reason why I emphasize that is because it's important for us to take the negative connotation away from the word bias. Most of us, when we hear bias, we think of it as negative. It's like, who wants to be called biased? I don't, But sometimes we say it in a positive way, but most times someone's saying you're biased and they're doing
it's like saying you're prejudiced.
Right, exactly. It doesn't necessarily feel right. But actually, it's not positive or negative. It's neutral. It is what makes us human. As I mentioned earlier, it's an automatic response, right? It happens without judgment. And so that is the thing that happens in the moment. But what happened before is what led to the moment, right? And so when you think about bias and you think about defining it and what it looks like, it's going to look different for every person. But the context is, and this is where it becomes really important for people to understand that everybody enters every conversation with some level of bias. And with that information alone, there's power, right? Because if I can acknowledge, Olivia, that you have bias and you acknowledge that you have bias and I acknowledge my biases, we can come to the table not trying to be perfect, not pretending that, we're in a workplace, so we're all objective. We're not objective. We're human beings. We're completely subjective in everything, right? So if we can have that respect for each other and understanding about each other, we can have a better conversation. If you say, listen, this kind of thing rubs me the wrong way. When I see this or hear that, it just rankles me for some reason. If I can be honest and say, listen, people of a certain ilk, a certain religion, a certain tribe, or whatever it is, for some reason, I just don't feel comfortable with them. And if I can say that to you,
or sexual orientation,
exactly, and if I can say that without feeling judged, and I can only do that if you say that to me too, right? We have to have a safe space to be able to have those conversations. It's leaders who create that kind of safe space, by the way, right? Leaders, if a leader's not able to do that for his or her team, it's oftentimes very difficult for a team to do it on their own. It's possible, but difficult. But when you have a leader who embraces that, man, it's just like, it's a waterfall. The team gets it. Everybody feels more comfortable to have those kind of conversations. It doesn't happen overnight, but it happens over time.